let's talk about this piece. So, what or who inspired you to write this piece? Describe to me the first steps of this process for you.
Sure. Well, I mean, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this later, but it's an interesting text choice to write a choral piece on a Supreme Court decision. But it's not my first time doing that. So I think that that's part of it. In 2015, 2016, one of the things I was really thinking about in terms of like what I would be spending my compositional time on is how can I make art relevant to sort of the social challenges that exist in our society, especially being authentic to my own identity. As a cis white guy like this, there's I have a tremendous amount of privilege, and I think I was looking for ways where I could sort of shine a light on ways that people like me have not done good things. And so I wrote a setting of Oliver Wendell Holmes' Supreme Court decision in Buck v. Bell, which is a 1927 case that upheld the legality of sterilizing the mentally feeble. And it's still good law. This law still exists on the books. And it's terrible. And thousands of people were sterilized for no reason at all other than discriminatory practice. Being able to sort of shine a light onto those kind of topics was sort of what got me initially involved in these kind of legal texts. And the other thing is that when I mentioned this to singers in my choir, that I always think it's weird when choirs sing very personal I statement kind of poetry, like I love you and the way that you walk down the street. And when like 75 people are singing that just feels like, whoa, it's a lot of people who love me. It feels like kind of a strange voice for the choir. I mean, it's fine. And there's lots of amazing music like that, but in terms of finding my own poetry or prose to set, what I like about legal opinions is that it's an individual person writing it, with a team, let's be honest, thank you, law clerks. But it speaks with an authority that is bigger than just one person. It speaks for the power of our government. It speaks for the mores of our society. And so I think a choral voice really fits that well. When you hear Supreme Court or judicial text sung, it feels like that should be sung by a choir. Singing that by like an individual, I think makes less sense. When you get a whole bunch of people together singing it, I think that really relates. And so for this piece specifically, I had written a couple of like pretty upsetting, challenging pieces that are, hard for people to find a way to program because they're on topics that, I'm so surprised that lots of people haven't picked up my, sterilizing the mentally feeble 10-minute piece for choir and string quartet and marimba and piano. It's so easy to fit that on a program. But I was thinking I would really love to find something that uses these kinds of ideas in terms of the approach, but is much more uplifting and hopeful. That's like some happy music and some beautiful music rather than just angular and intense and leaves you walking away like, so, which was 100% my artistic goal for those kinds of pieces. So, but I wanted something different. And the way that the specific piece sort of came into being was that we actually had a challenge grant by one of our donors for the chorale, who said, if we meet this level of funding in our annual campaign, I'll match it, and Scott will write a song for Mary. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'm happy to do that. And I started to think about what kind of song that would be. I'm pretty sure their idea of this was that I would like pick up my acoustic guitar and write like a cute little song for Mary and make it like a nice little YouTube video of it. And then everyone would be like, oh, that's sweet.
With ukulele.
Yeah, exactly. And instead I was like, well, what if I wrote this like 9-movement choral orchestral work on a Supreme Court text? And they were like, well, that's okay too. And so that was sort of the birth of the idea, was like, let me write this piece for my partner to honor her and our relationship, and also the way that this decision has been impactful in our lives and the lives of our family and friends, and that the ways that this decision strengthens our own relationship, in by allowing people to have access to this institution of marriage. And so going through the text, it felt like, wow, this is like the perfect sort of, oh God, sorry, this is the perfect marriage of the sort of background I had had in writing on legal texts, but also the desire I had to honor something, like find something that would honor my partnership with Mary, and then also move me in a more uplifting and hopeful direction to write the music. And so, yeah, I'm really excited about sort of how that text came together. Plus, it was during the pandemic. This was like in the spring of 2020. And so I was looking to escape Zoom choir and video editing. And so nothing says escape like imagining what a 30-minute choral orchestral work might be. So
Right, right. I wouldn't really consider that procrastinating.
yes and no, I don't know. Yeah.
Going back to this text, what is in your mind complicated? I mean, we can all pretty much fathom a guess about how complicated it is to set text, that's peppered with intellectual language and words that we may not really think about setting ever. And on the flip side, how does this text align with maybe your compositional style?
Yeah, thanks, Miles. That's a great question. Well, I can show you one thing sort of about process maybe that might be interesting for folks to see, and then we can talk a little bit more specifically about this question. So, um, this is a little behind the scenes, but if you all can see this, this is the first thing that I did when I was setting this, when I was thinking about creating this piece, was I obviously read the decision. And then I went back going through the decision and I pulled out excerpts of things that I thought were significant topically, in terms of the overall argument, the idea, the way the opinion is structured. And so this document here is all those lines just sort of pulled out of order or in order from reading the text. And then what I started doing was grouping them in various different ways. So you can see like there's like, here's a little dash, and this is like stuff that ended up being at the end of the piece. This felt, oh, that's kind of like a good end. But all of this stuff is just sort of sequentially going through. And I found like little blocks like this that I ends up being basically exactly like that in the piece. But then there's other things like this, like the right of same-sex couples to marry, that is part of the liberty promised by the 14th Amendment, is derived too from that amendment's guarantee. This did not make the cut. This,
Why?
this
But why?
not in the piece.
Yeah.
Because it was too much, so you have to adapt, right? You can't just like go, all right, I'm going to set every word of the opinion, because that doesn't lend itself to a musical setting. So, this then ended up coming into the fifth movement, which is the Due Process and Equal Protection Clause, which is a movement that sort of uses the way these two clauses interact with each other as an allegory also for relationships, and the way that two people can sort of come together and complement, inform each other, create something bigger than exists without those two. And then it's also complicated and difficult for those two things to interrelate, and confusing sometimes. And I think all of that is like, it's the nerdiest love poem that I could possibly write. So, but then what I did was started grouping things, and you can see here, this is where sort of 4 principles and traditions to be discussed. I see Justice Kennedy lays that out as a sort of organizational structure, and I'm like, okay, well, that sounds useful. And so that's where this then starts, which is like, this was my drafting of what the structure was going to be. So like some kind of like, here's what marriage in America is like. Then each of the four principles with some kind of interstitial thing between them that comments on those principles or links them back and forth between each other or gives a different perspective. I think about like a book like The Grapes of Wrath. And one of my favorite things about that Steinbeck novel is that there are those interchapters, which are just sort of commentary outside of the plot that, and they're my favorite parts about that book. And so I think about like that sort of ability to have commentary. And I think it's an interesting framework. So that's sort of where these other movements came from, and then a conclusion at the end. And so then I started pasting the things that I thought went into those sections into each of the places. And then it eventually got to, sorry, I'm scrolling fast. This, which I just literally rearranged the text into something that looked more like poetry so that I would stop thinking of it as like scary Supreme Court text. And this seems totally fine to set. This looks like poetry and it feels like poetry, actually. And I even called it poetic libretto because I'm nerdy and felt like that would help me. So, so that's a little bit about like how I took that text from its original source and then moved it into something that I felt like I could deal with. Then I literally just had sitting on my piano a printout of that poetic libretto and was writing notes on it and saying like, here's maybe this movement's fast, maybe this movement's slow. And that sort of started the planning of the whole thing. But I think to the other part of your question that you were asking, Myles, I love rhythm a lot. And I think the words that you end up getting in prose like this creates more opportunities for interesting rhythms from the choir. And so I love that about this kind of text. I think it ends up impelling me to write things in a way that are very speech rhythm derived. And then it makes it more interesting because we're saying words that you don't normally say. Like one of our favorites is constitutional imperatives. That's a word that not everybody sings every day in their choir concerts.
But it's very rhythmic.
Yeah, constitutional imperatives. Feels good.
Yeah.
So.
Well, thank you for kind of giving us an inside scoop of your process. How beautiful it is to be able to transform seemingly non-poetic text into literal poetry. It's amazing. Other than the Obergefell text, decision text, you incorporated two other pieces of text. And I'm curious to know what moved you to add those texts into, I believe it's what, the seventh movement, or why not just standalone have the text from the decision, and why include those pieces?
Yeah, well, I thought about it, about even being more expansive in terms of including other texts, because there are aspects of the Kennedy opinion that I feel like don't necessarily go to all of the places emotionally or character wise where you might want to go in a given movement, right? It ends up feeling a little bit didactic, or just this is the presentation of the opinion. And although I think a lot of his language is also kind of flowery and like broad strokes and reaches far, like it feels expansive in the way that it thinks. And so I also think there are great moments where it already felt poetic. It just needed to be organized that way, in a sense. But I definitely had the idea that if was gonna write a piece about marriage, that it kind of would be cool to include a section where we are at least alluding to vows. And I told the story to the choirs, but for me, pardon me, Mary and I have been to like a ton of weddings, and she had this idea that and I don't know where she got this from, but this was certainly her idea in our relationship, that vows, when a couple is exchanging vows in a wedding ceremony, um, that it's an opportunity to use that as a rededication of your own vows by sort of imagining saying those along with the couple. And so that's something that we've done when we go to marriage, like weddings. We, hold hands during that time. We think about like our own vows, and it's a fun opportunity to sort of recommit to the relationship. And so I felt like having the opportunity for that to be a piece of this work would be really great. But the other thing is, my wife is a public law attorney. She works for the county of Santa Clara. Um, Before that, she worked for the Office for Civil Rights for the Department of Education in DC. And she advises the registrar of voters here in Santa Clara County. And I'm amazed how many brilliant, hardworking people work in government to make democracy happen in our country. And it blows my mind. Like, because I think often the sort of like narrative out there in the world, like in our country, is that like government is super dysfunctional. There's sort of like the story, like the imagination of like the DMV, which is like purgatory on earth, although ours isn't the worst. So thanks, California. But, there's this idea of like this incredible amount of dysfunction. But there's also behind the scenes that maybe the public doesn't always see, just so many incredibly competent people who work so hard and care so much about making sure that our country continues to operate, and that the voices of the people are represented, and that like we have this democratic thing that is America. And so I liked the idea of the commitment that those public servants make, including Supreme Court justices, that they say in their oath of office, which is from the U.S. Code that we quote. And so there's a place where, and I can show this actually, for those who may not have seen it, in this eighth movement, actually. So sorry about that. Eighth movement, we have marriage is a keystone of our social order. Just as a couple vows to support each other, so does society pledge to support the couple. And I think it's this text right here that was like, oh my God, we have to use the vows. And so we're using this a slightly modified version of the alternative service book as the source for the vow text. And then this U.S. Code section 3331 as the I do solemnly swear that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States. And so in our version, this originally starts as two soloists, and then the tenors and basses join. And then over top of that, the sopranos and altos come in with the oath of office text. And so we are sort of able to examine different kinds, but supporting kinds of commitment overlapping each other. And I think it helps to sort of show the way that society supports the couple through the way that we function, right? And whether that's through doing the work of government, or whether that's also, caring about a couple that's married. Like that's one of the things that Justice Kennedy is saying, is that our society values marriage and thinks it's a worthy institution that we as a society should support. The scoring of the piece is for choir, string orchestra, so 2 violin parts, viola, cello, double bass, piano, and then percussion, which is marimba and chimes. So not like 400 percussion instruments, just a few. And this is an ensemble that is a slightly expanded version of the kind of ensemble I used for Buck v. Bell. And I really like the combination of strings, piano, and percussion, because strings can give you this long, lush connection and rich, amazing line. And then piano and percussion can give you motoric precision in a way that like strings have a little bit of a harder time doing on their own. They certainly can, but I think those combinations of those abilities for these different kinds of skills of the instrument, sort of what's most idiomatic to them, is really compelling for me. And I think it, without going full orchestra, you know, winds and brass and all of that, I think this is an ensemble that really works well to feel symphonic and full, which was one of my goals also. The piece is also intended to be able to be performed by string quintet, piano and percussion, to hopefully allow smaller choirs, maybe with limited budget, to be able to do this piece as well. So that's a hope for the future. But I'm delighted that we have the full orchestra for our performance. The opening, I think, is a really good example of how I like rhythm. It's these repeated sort of that blossom out into a chord, and then shows some of the like dissonant but pretty dissonance that I like to write for choirs. So there's a lot of notes that are right up against each other, but hopefully it still sounds beautiful. That's it's not meant to be like angular and intense. So maybe we can listen to a little bit of the start here, hear a little bit of the introduction. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of the opening sound. There's a couple of things that I was trying to do here. I felt like this could become a piece where everything is slow and pretty. And so I was trying to find ways to not just be slow and pretty, but maybe be fast and pretty. Um, so the rhythmic impetus behind the writing at the beginning from the orchestra was something that I felt would immediately give us energy at the beginning of the piece, rather than it just being like slow and serene. I wanted there to be some urgency to the beauty of how important we think marriage is as a society. And I did not originally write it this way. I started off thinking it was going to be slow and pretty and take forever to sort of get to a place where it moved. And then I scrapped all that because it was bad and ended up with this instead. So, and I really, this also is where the piece comes to at the end as well. So the last movement has some of this music exactly return on different text. And so there's also then sort of a arc to the entire piece so that we get to hear some of the familiar things that we heard at the beginning. And one of the things you'll certainly notice throughout the piece is that that marriage idea comes back all the time. That motive gets used in a lot of different ways throughout the piece and is one of the recurring themes. So that's a little bit of the first movement, which is this sort of like swimmy and pretty thing. The second movement is the first principle. And this ended up being a sort of waltz in a way. Here, the question that is sort of being laid out is that the first principle is that this is a very important decision that couples get to make about whether they will be married and to whom they get married. And so throughout this movement, that whether and whom is isolated. And we hear that a lot because that's sort of the crux of the principle. Like, you can choose whether you would like to get married, and you can choose to whom you would like to get married. being one of the principles of marriage. And so here, let's see if I can find a little bit of this. I think it'll be around here. Oh, perfect. And in the first movement, where sopranos and altos start out, then they do it again. And they ask a third time. And the tenors and basses have this. So, and then there's a B section, and then that music returns at the end, but the strings get the melody, and the choir is just asking whether and whom all the time. For me, this movement ends up feeling like some kind of like weird Sondheim-y waltz. I don't know. The harmony feels like bluesy, but from like an academic perspective. So, I did not think I would write a movement like this at all when I started this piece. So this was kind of a fun surprise. And then the third movement is probably the most like some of my other music, which is really rhythmic and intense. And it's called The Nature of Injustice. And in this movement, the texts are referencing other cases that were limiting, like where the limit of marriage equality was being tested. So it talks about Loving, which was about the right to interracial marriage. It also talks about Turner and Zablocki, which were about inmates to marry and fathers with unpaid child support to marry. Like, basically the question being, is there a sufficient justification for limiting access to marriage from a specific group of people? And the title line of this movement comes from Justice Kennedy's comment about how the nature of injustice is that we may not see it in our own time. Understanding that society's norms shift, and that I think we as a society, I'm hopeful, generally look back on laws that barred interracial marriage as completely inappropriate. And we now see that as a society, this is totally fine and great. But it wasn't able to be seen in that same light during that period of time. And he's making the point that same-sex marriage is much the same, that we may not see that injustice in this particular time, but later, as we move along the arc of history, that will be something that people can look back on and go, wow, it's amazing that was a thing that was happening in America. So I think that point is, and especially because it shows the long journey of marriage equality, that it's not just Obergefell, but a long history of cases and of people being denied the right to marry for all kinds of reasons, of which this is all a part, and how marriage equality is about opening up that access. So I can play a little bit of this for you all. It has a pretty dramatic opening, and then we move into this very rhythmic section that's sort of driven by the piano, with a lot of interjections by the strings. And the choir is singing a lot of tight intervals against each other. So here, I'll see if I can find it. Maybe here-ish. Here's our constitutional imperatives. Was there a sufficient justification for exclusion? I feel like that gives a little bit of an idea of some of like the breadth of style that's happening in the piece. It was something that I really wanted to make sure it just wasn't all one note. Um, and so to find ways to engage with the text in different parts of the aspects of the text to sort of bring out the different emotional qualities of it. And so there's fast and pretty, there's slow and pretty, and then there's kind of like fast and urgent and angular. So there's a lot of different sort of musical moments in the piece, but I think also a through line of like harmonic and rhythmic language that hopefully holds it all together, and some motivic unity that you'll see on various different words and phrases that come back time and time again throughout the piece that hopefully unify it. So there's a lot more to it, but I think it gives you a good idea of some of the background of it, without me playing for you all of the MIDI files, which will only make you sad. So,
Scott, are there any favorite lines of text or any, like the climax of the piece to you, or one moment that's meaningful to you and Mary's relationship? What movement does that fall in, and so that we can kind of hear that during the piece?
yeah, I mean, I think certainly the vows overlapping, I think is a really, as I mentioned previously, is I think a really significant moment in terms of like a moment I was really trying to create in the piece. And I love when that happens. And at the end, there's this sort of build um of the tenors and basses singing, "This is my solemn vow," which is the last line of that vow. And then eventually the sopranos and altos come in with the last line of the oath of office, which is, "So help me God." And these overlap and cascade over top of each other while the strings are doing this ascending figure. And then the strings take over those motives to end that movement. And I think that is a place where I feel like the musical imagination of composing, where I was like, I can really imagine what this might feel like when we're doing it in the space, and I think that could be hopefully a really special moment. I think to see those two things interrelate and to overlap like that, I'm really excited about. Um, the fifth movement has, which is the due process and equal protection clause. um, was the first movement I started writing, and then I had a really hard time figuring out where to go from there. That I I had written maybe, like 16 measures of it, and I just didn't really know what was next. And I knew I really wanted that movement to be awesome, but I couldn't figure out what to do with it. And so then I started writing the like eighth movement, and then like wrote the first movement and the second movement and the third movement and the fourth movement, and then made it back to the fifth movement. And I was like, well, crap, I guess I got to write this now. Um, so, and then I like really tried to, and I've talked with this about some with I've talked about this before with some folks, but that was a movement where I really felt like I was like pushing my creativity through a sieve, and that I was just like getting out all the impurities and was just like trying to make it work. But it ended up giving me one of the moments of the piece that I think I most enjoy, because I really wanted a moment where like there was a big sing where the choir opens up and just gets to release vocally. Because I think a lot of music that's composed now ends up sort of like sitting in one environment where like maybe you just have pretty chords with lots of tight harmonies, but you never like get a moment to like sing a melody full and rich. And so I really wanted a moment like that. And in the fifth movement, where that occurs, which let's see if I can show it to you. Um, is, on a text that everybody would assume would be the big moment of the piece. Uh, this interrelation of the two furthers our understanding of what freedom is and must become. Um, talking about the relationship between those two clauses, right? But also, I think thinking about it from the perspective of like this one for me, when I think about it in the context of relationship, like the interrelation of two people furthers our understanding of what freedom is and must become. Like that blows my mind to think about it from that line of thinking. And so I hope that feels like that when we get there. That it really just opens up and feels so like such full committed singing and such a big moment in the piece. I think the other really big moment is right at the end of the work. Mary, I had said, Mary, are there any things that you want me to make sure I do or don't do? And she was like, well, don't end the piece quietly. And I was like, oh crap. So I kind of do end it a little bit quietly. But right before I do that, it's really loud. So I tried to compromise. And the big moment here is this: two people become something greater than once they were, a love that will endure even past death. And this love that will endure even past death is where the chimes come back in and have this pattern that, because if you're going to write a piece about marriage and you're going to have some chimes there, you need the wedding bells come in moment. And so this is the big wedding bells come in moment. And they're kind of like out of time with the rest of the ensemble and slow down and sort of decay as the piece comes in. So I think that could be a really exciting moment. I'm really excited to hear how that sort of comes together. So yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of moments I'm really looking forward to hearing come to fruition. And that's been one of the really rewarding parts about the process, is like when you're composing music and you're just sort of sitting there imagining the possibility of the future, you never really know how well it's actually going to work when you hear it with the real people. And then when you do, through the rehearsal process, it's really exciting, because sometimes you're like, that's just like I imagined it. And then other times you're like, that's way harder than I imagined it being. And then you have to work harder to get it to sound like you imagined it, because it wasn't as accessible as you were hoping it would be. but I think we're really getting there in all of these places, which is really exciting.
Yeah, well, and there's also something rewarding for the singers and for the orchestra players, and also for you, I'm sure, that you're conducting your own premiere, and there's something like uniquely authentic about that, because you don't have, you know, another conductor and his her or their gesture, the way that they interpret the piece, their biases. We're hearing directly from the source, and it's something that's just, again, so uniquely rewarding, and just makes it more authentic. Is that kind of how you feel as well?
Yes and no. I think I very much value the opportunity to get to bring this together, bring this to life with the people that I'm getting to work with on it. It's just that is tremendously rewarding, and to see their excitement and enthusiasm around working on it has been really humbling. And you know, the chorale especially has really enjoyed the opportunity to work with composers and bring new works to life. And so this is a kind of different environment of that same thing, where it's like, but it's the guy we know all the time. Like, it's just Scott, but it's his work and he's the composer also. So um, I think there have been similarities to the enthusiasm and the life that it brings the organization when we bring in a composer to work with us. But it's also different because it's like, but I'm the guy who's always around. So it puts me sort of in both contexts. There are times where I'm like, I really should have just gotten Barbara to conduct this. Because then I wouldn't have had to stress about it. And like, it would have been really fun to get to watch somebody else interpret it. Because I think conductors bring their own perspective and then are able to get different things out of it than you as a composer might imagine. So there are ways in which I feel like I do know what the intent was behind these things, but it would have also been interesting to see what other people would have thought the intent was, because they might make cooler choices, you know. But I am hopeful. I think this work is much more accessible and approachable than I think a lot of the other pieces that I've written. And I have several friends who are conductors of choirs, not dissimilar to the chorale or our university choirs, who are, I think, strongly considering programming this in future seasons. And so that would be a delight. I would love to get, and I think in some ways would be the best of both worlds, to have gotten to do the conducting of the original premiere with these fantastic people, and then later get to just show up and have people have learned it and me go like, hey, that sounds great. You know, I've gotten to do that as a composer a few times, to get to work with the ensemble that's learned my piece. And that is bizarre when you show up and the choir just knows the music you wrote and you didn't teach it to them. You're like, what? Spending your time on my stuff? That's cool. So yeah, I look forward to that as a hopeful possibility as well. But it is a unique privilege to get to conduct my own works. And yeah, hope I try to, you know, treat it with the same level of like preparation and score study as I do with other pieces too. Like, because it's a different thing to write it and then to teach it. They're two separate things. So
Well, we feel an equal amount of privilege to be able to experience this piece and this journey alongside you. So thank you. Well, thank you all for being here, and enjoy the rest of your day. Scott, thank you so much again for taking time away from your very busy schedule with Into the Woods and the concert coming up next week, and the end of the school year, everything. So thank you, Scott.
thanks. My pleasure. It was so much fun. Thanks, everybody.